Everyday Business Solutions, the podcast that offers you the right perspective on achieving success. Hello, everyone, and welcome to Everyday Business Solutions. My name is Haley Morris, your podcast coordinator and host, and we are officially launching into our new schedule for our content. For the month of June 2021, we're actually going to be broaching a topic that is extremely relevant. Businesses are starting to drift back into their buildings. We're starting to travel for trade shows more, attend more events like weddings, and who knows what else at this point. And safety and health is still a big concern because COVID is still lingering and we're only partially vaccinated as a country. So, with that, I've actually brought on LabDX, who does COVID testing and is very familiar with this realm of things. And we have our amazing guest, Humberto. Did I say that right?
Yes, you did.
He will be talking to us today about what he does, his company, and things that we can keep in mind as we move forward. So, if you don't mind introducing yourself.
Sure. Yeah. Thanks for having me. My name is Humberto Buniotto. I'm the CEO of LabDX. We are a what's called a high complexity laboratory located in Miami, Florida. We have for the last year been primarily doing what's called a PCR test, which is the test everyone has heard about in the news, where you drive somewhere, they swab your nose, send it to a lab, takes 2-3 days. Uh, we've been doing that for about a year, since the beginning of the pandemic, and for the last 4 to 5 months, we've sort of pivoted our strategy to focus on more longer term strategies around testing for events, testing for large venues, testing for employers, and not just providing the laboratory services that people have come to expect, like providing the results, but more focused around a complete solution for businesses for any sort of group or industry that's looking to kind of get back to normal.
So, what do you mean by like complete service? What does that encompass for you?
So when you talk to uh, an employer, or we do a lot of work with the cruise lines, for example, the cruise operators that arguably have been the most impacted by the pandemic because they really haven't been able to do anything since March 10th of last year. When you talk to these groups, the information that we've been given to them in terms of testing and social distancing and washing your hands and wearing a mask and being able to trace when somebody's been exposed, they, from our perspective, they've been bombarded with so much information over the last 12 months that it's been hard for them to make an educated decision on what path to go down. So when I go to them and say, hey, you should PCR test everybody, or you should rapid test everybody, or you should do antibody testing, all of these things, to somebody who's not from the lab space, from the infectious disease space, is just like gibberish. Nobody really knows, what avenue they should go. It's very expensive to test people, and so what we decided to do is to kind of take a step back and say, okay, if I'm an employer, if I'm we're in Miami, so we cater to a lot of the service industry, hotels, resorts, restaurants, things like that. If I'm a hotel operator, what are the things that I need to worry about, right? Do I have to test all of my guests coming in? Do I have to test all of my employees? How often? What do I do if somebody actually comes up positive? So we decided to say, let's kind of create sort of a reference book for them to refer to and cater to each specific industry. So obviously we're not involved in all of the industries, but we've picked a couple of different industries around primarily around the service space that we can help. So instead of going to a restaurant, for example, or a hotel and saying, hey, just PCR test everybody once a week, we come in and say, okay, how many people do you have working here? How many tables do you have in the place? How many guests are you wanting to allow based on the state regulation? What are the hours of the people working here? What kind of, and we analyze the entire operation, and then we provide them with a solution that includes testing, but is not limited to testing. So it's a little bit beyond the scope of just being a laboratory. We decided if people are just getting, because when you think about like even the cruise lines, for example, these are billion-dollar companies. They're not small, but they're in the hospitality business. They've never had to deal with a pandemic before, so you can't expect them to overnight just know everything that needs to be done to contain, infectious disease inside of a ship. So even talking to those guys, we can feel when we're talking to them that there's so much confusion, that they're just being bombarded. And so we decided, instead of bombarding them with information, let's take a step back, come in from a more comprehensive approach, offer the laboratory services that we are specialized in, but also everything else that comes with it. So working with janitorial services that can come in and provide special types of cleaning supplies and other things that are less harmful to the environment. Working with other laboratories that offer services we don't offer, providing things like rapid testing solutions, kind of like help them navigate the guidelines of state, local, and federal social distancing requirements. So I hope I'm not overwhelming you, but that's kind of kind of like what we're involved in right now.
No, it's very interesting because it's everything that's going around. Like, I've heard of all of this stuff at some point or another, probably more times than I could count. But to kind of pull it together and to make sense of what it means and what business leaders and employees actually need to pay attention to. I mean, that's the big thing. And that's part of the reason we brought you on today, is help make sense of all of this information and all of these things and these misconceptions or rumors surrounding testing and vaccinations and health and safety procedures. So I'm really curious as far as the various types of testing, because when you hear COVID testing, you hear like, oh, it takes a couple days. And then some people say, oh, I got it back the same day. And for the general populace, like, most of us, I would assume, don't know the difference between the testing and the benefits of each one and why you would go with one versus a different one. So can you kind of talk us through those types of testing?
Yeah, sure. So I think that's been the different types of tests and how they can kind of play a role in prevention has probably been the biggest challenge for us. We've had to do a lot of education, a lot of clarifying misconceptions, and kind of guide our customers in the right direction. So, but in a nutshell, there's basically, for COVID, there are basically two types of tests that are available. There are different versions of each, but the primary two tests that are available right now, or that have been in the last 12 months, are the rapid antigen testing and then the PCR test. And there's also sort of a variation of the PCR test called a LAMP test. It's less common, but it's just as accurate. So when people say, I got my results in 15 minutes, or I got my results in an hour, generally they're talking about a rapid test. That's the antigen test, or RADT, rapid antigen direct test. That's what the rapid test is. The tests that take longer, and these are the ones that you probably remember early on in the pandemic, people would complain about getting the tests in a week and it didn't matter anymore because, after 7 days, what do you care that you were positive 7 days ago? If you were positive, you've already infected a bunch of people. So that's the PCR test. And that's the test that's actually done at a laboratory. So it requires specific equipment. it's a very delicate test. The virus is obviously airborne, so actually taking a swab from somebody, a specimen, and then you're basically what you're doing is you're taking a mixture and you're extracting the virus from it, and then you're analyzing it to see if it's in fact a COVID-19 version of the virus, right? Uh, and, I don't want to get too technical, but essentially that's what you're doing there. You're trying to identify the virus itself. On the antigen test, what you're trying to identify is the substance that's reproducing while the virus is infecting the person. So when you become exposed to the virus, um, it takes roughly 2 to 3 days for incubation, and during that process, these antigens are reproducing in your body. So when you're doing a rapid test, what you're trying to identify is there reproduction of the virus in this person's immune system? And so, why are they used, and what are the applications of each? So, for the antigen test, they're really effective on the early stages of infection because you're picking up the replication of this substance in your body. So if you've been exposed, say today, for example, and you do an antigen test tomorrow or Sunday, it's likely going to come up positive, right? Because it's in the replication process. If you were exposed today, say, for example, you and I were meeting in person and I was infected and passed it on to you, and you immediately go to a test site and do a PCR test, which is considered the gold standard, you would likely come up negative because it's too soon to conduct that test. The virus has not yet incubated in your body, right? So the rapid test is really good in the early stages, but it's not as accurate as a PCR test. And the PCR test is the gold standard. It's got about a 95 to 100 to 99% accuracy rate, but it's not very good on the first or second day of infection, right? Now, the reason that the rapid tests haven't been used more widely is because early on, a lot of these rapid tests were being mass produced to kind of obviously meet the demand. Millions of people needed to be tested. And so there were a lot of really bad tests pumped into the market. Some of them had a accuracy rate of 60%, which is, it's really bad when you think about it. Imagine if you were to do, I don't know, say a pregnancy test and you had a 60% accuracy rate, you would probably not, you'd want to choose a different method. And in a lot of ways, a pregnancy test is comparable to an antigen test. And that's the reason sometimes people would do 2 tests and then they'll go to a doctor to confirm because the accuracy is just not there, right? So early on, they got kind of a bad rap for not being accurate. And then PCR just kind of became the only test that people trusted. And the rapid test kind of got phased out. More recently, as of, I don't know, beginning of the year, a lot of really good tests were made available. And so rapid tests are being more widely used now, including if you're flying abroad outside of the States and you're flying back into the States, a rapid test is acceptable as proof of test. You don't need to get a PCR test when you're flying back into the States. And that's because a lot of these tests are actually a little more accurate than before. They're not as accurate as a PCR test. I think the best tests out there have an accuracy rate of roughly 90%. But if you're testing a lot of people, 1 person out of 10, it could be problematic. If you're, say, letting them meet in person, for example, if 1 person comes in and they're positive, the chances of them infecting everybody else is high.
Now, as far as it's the PCR test, right? What is the effective rate of that right now on average?
So the PCR test, there are different protocols and different manufacturers make different sort of menus for these tests. The accuracy rate of some of the best tests out there are somewhere around 99.5%. So in other words, if you tested positive, you can be pretty certain that you're positive. And like I said, on the rapid tests, I think the best ones out there right now are roughly 90%. Now, there is a sort of a second variation of rapid tests, and those are not so the rapid tests I was talking about before, they are kind of like, well, I guess I'll go back to the pregnancy test. They're kind of like, you swab your nose, you mix it with a liquid, you drop 3 droplets into a kit, and that kit has 1 or 2 lines. If one of the lines appear, you're negative. If 2 lines appear, you're positive. So it's very much like a pregnancy test in that sense. There are some what's called an instrumented rapid test, which is basically, it's almost like a little coffee maker machine that, you do the collection the same way. You drop it into a cartridge and you put it in the machine. So it's being analyzed by an actual laboratory instrument. And those are actually a lot more accurate than those older rapid tests that are more like a pregnancy test. And those roughly have an accuracy rate of somewhere between, I don't know, some of them are like 97%. And most importantly, they're a lot more affordable, which makes them a much better option long term, right? Because early on, when we started, we were charging as much as, over $100 for a PCR test. And we were working for, different governments and, state and local. We were working for employer groups, for all sorts of different entities, and they didn't have a choice. It was $100, $120 for a test. And you could see how you could basically bankrupt the company. Imagine if your company had to PCR test everyone every week. It would be horrible. And a lot of companies didn't have a choice. Companies like factories or assembly lines and things like that, they can't work remote, so they really didn't have a choice. And so these rapid tests are a lot more affordable, a lot more portable, because you can pretty much set them up in any workspace, and a lot more accurate than the old rapid tests.
So if they're using that new rapid test, is that something like the employees or whoever management would just do themselves? They don't have to have somebody come in and monitor it or anything?
That's an interesting question, because there are different collection swabs for these tests. So generally speaking, you have what's called a nasopharyngeal swab, which is the one that people complain goes too deep. A lot of people refer to it as a brain swab, because you're trying to hit the back of your nose, the nasopharyngeals. That's one, and that's 100% supervised. So when you have that collection, you're normally being swabbed by a nurse or a medical assistant or somebody like that. Then there's something called a mid-turbine or anterior nares swab, which is basically your nose. So that's those, most of them, the person can swab themselves and they can do the test. Best practices for these tests is for somebody else to be doing the collection, only because if you're swabbing yourself, you tend not to go deep enough and you're not collecting enough of a sort of a viral load. If you have somebody who's trained to do it, they're likely going to be able to kind of, go where the swab needs to go to collect enough of a sample. So there's actually a study from, I think, Stanford that came out a couple months ago that said people self-swabbing have a 50% chance of, if your sample is collected by a medical professional, you're twice as likely to get an accurate result as opposed to if you swab yourself. And that's because somebody who's trained knows how to do it. Then there's an oral swab, which is basically you swab your cheeks, under your tongue, the roof of your mouth. And then there's a throat swab, which is also the mouth swab is normally self-swabbed, and then the throat swab is something that somebody would collect for you. Uh, why are there so many methods? Essentially because it's all part of your lung system, right? So because the virus is located in your lungs, um, any sort of connection with your lungs is a sort of a point of collection when you can obtain a sample of the virus. Um, Generally speaking, the nasopharyngeal swab, the one that kind of goes back behind your nose, is the most accurate. And that's because it's the closest collection point from your lungs. And it just makes sense if you're going to try to collect as much of a sample as possible, you go there. But it's also very invasive, not very invasive, but more invasive than the others. You end up crying because, it just doesn't feel good, and it requires somebody to do the collection.
So what are you seeing most businesses implement when they're picking one of these processes, or they're looking for an option?
It's kind of all over the place right now. I think especially with the advent of vaccinations kind of ramping up very quickly since January, February, a lot of businesses still sort of trying to see how things are going to go for the rest of the year. Um, Generally, with the larger companies that we work with, they do spot testing twice a month, once a month, or um, they follow guidelines. And whenever somebody says that they're symptomatic, then they'll send us in to get them tested. Um, with the cruise operators, we've seen them test a lot of their crew very often. And that's because they're mandated by the government. It's not a decision that they made. Um, they've been put through a lot of very strict guidelines to continue to operate. And unlike, a lot of businesses that unfortunately had to close, even if they wanted to, they didn't have a choice. I mean, they have huge ships that have to keep floating and functioning and being cleaned and being maintained. And so even at zero cruising, commercial cruising, they still had to maintain all of their crew. I think each of their ships requires 150 crew just to stay afloat, which is unbelievable. Plus all of their management and all those people. So for those guys, they've been testing pretty often, and just randomly when people come in and out of ports, come in and out of ships. They have a lot of really strict regulation, and arguably probably one of the most proactive industries that I've worked with. But it's kind of all over the map right now, and I think companies are kind of waiting for a little bit of a standard from the larger companies. You hear all the time about this vaccine passport, which is how are you going to be able to get around and show that you've been vaccinated? There are a couple of companies competing in that space right now to become sort of the standard for being able to show it on your phone, for example, that you've been vaccinated. Mm-hmm. And so I think because the vaccines are starting to ramp up and it's an additional expense, what we're seeing is that businesses are being a little more resistant to test a lot of their staff, just kind of waiting to see what's going to happen once most people have been vaccinated sometime in June. For right now, they're just kind of, following guidelines, best practices, and it varies, right? I was in California last weekend, and everything is just locked down. I went to a restaurant, the tables are 10 feet apart. You go to an ice cream shop, only one person inside at a time. And then you go to Florida, and it's kind of like whatever you want to do. It's not, the guidelines are not necessarily being followed. And, it's just kind of how it is. It depends. It varies widely based on the state, based on the size of the companies, and that's what we're seeing right now.
Mhm. I've noticed as far as restrictions, because I'm right up in Toledo, so we're right against the Michigan line, and Michigan's been a little up and down with their regulation, and at times been one of the stricter states. Um, and I've noticed, aside from like the broader state regulations, like the cities I've been to, so like Toledo, Dayton, Columbus, they tend to be significantly stricter than if you go to a smaller town or a village and stuff, where sometimes they're like, I don't even know where a mask is. I haven't had one in months, that sort of thing. So it's very interesting to see, just as a like, somebody not in that space walking around in different locations, but also now that coming back into the office is a question for many people, and coming back into a workspace after being remote for a year plus for many of us. It's okay. What's our office doing to be, protect us? How are we going to be safe? A lot of spaces weren't built to be 6 feet apart or things like that. And, that question is, we have cubicles. You can't really like just up and move those around super easy. So then the testing comes back into, and it's like, well, how many people can you guarantee haven't had it or have been vaccinated or both? Like they've had the test and they're vaccinated, and they're good, and things like that. So it's very interesting to see. And it's like you said, I think I've seen a lot of businesses that are just kind of holding off on a decision.
Yeah.
What would you ideally like to see businesses doing as far as like the rapid tests versus some of the other options, and what business, like a business policy around it, would ideally be?
It's a pretty difficult question because, it's when you turn on the news or you hear some expert talk about, testing, 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 you should be doing this and that. Doesn't matter how you look at it, it comes down to cost, right?
Hmm.
So, you know, if you're running Coca-Cola or a large company, you have the budget to be able to go out and test everybody, put barriers in place, make sure people can work remote and all of that. If you're running a barber shop, um, that's your thing. Like people have to physically come in, you have to touch them. They have to be in a space. You're licensed in that one space, and so the luxuries of working remote or having a hybrid workspace, or they're just not there. So um, I think it would probably, for me, um, it would probably be for the spaces where, such as a barber shop, for example, where they don't have a choice, they've got to continue operating, and there has to be customer contact. Um, for the longer term, at least through 2021, I would say, and there are plenty of businesses already doing this, but I would say stay on top of social distancing guidelines. Oftentimes I go into a small business like a restaurant that's right down the street from us here, and inevitably you got somebody behind the counter, they got their mask down on their chin, or you can see they're just kind of handling money from a customer and they're not really wiping or using hand sanitizer and things like that. So maybe trying to abide more uh, to those sort of easy to implement guidelines that just take some diligence. um, I think on the small business side, that's what I would like to see, because it's really kind of unreasonable to expect that a nail salon is going to test all of their staff once a week at, say, $60 a person, that they're going to buy software that's going to track where people have been. You just don't have the bandwidth for that. You literally, if you're operating a small business, you're you know doing nails, you're doing accounting, you're hiring, you're doing the scheduling. You don't have like a compliance person to put in place. For the larger companies, I think they have a little more of a responsibility because they have the resources. um, and so what I would like to see this year is for more rapid testing initiatives to be put in place. So Companies that are making their employees go back to an office, I think that they should have access to testing at all times, whether it's one of those instrumented tests that I mentioned before, um, or some sort of test that goes back to a laboratory, or some version of testing where if they feel like they're symptomatic or they've been exposed, they can get that test at no charge to them. And a combination of some sort of tracing. So when you put a lot of people into a space, um, like a big company that has, say, 100 employees in a space, it doesn't matter how many barriers you put up, how many cubicles or whatever, this thing is airborne. So, having an acrylic barrier between you and me isn't going to, like the virus isn't going to say, oh, there's a barrier, I can't go anywhere. It's air. So I would like to see, and there are plenty of companies that are doing a really good job with this and offering some really innovative solutions, but I'd like to see some way for employees to be notified that somebody else tested positive in the business. So there's a company out in Chile. They're actually starting a venture here in the States, and we're working with them called HAP USA, HAPP USA. And what they do is they have all the employees download an app um, once a day or twice a week, depends on, again, the company's parameters and how they want to handle it. They'll make employees, or they'll require employees to answer a health questionnaire. So, have you been exposed? Have you traveled? Do you think somebody in your house has COVID-19? Things like that, just to kind of keep track of it. And the application also keeps track of their distance from a person that's been exposed. So essentially, the way it works is every mobile device, every employee's phone has sort of a virtual bubble around it. And if two bubbles kind of come in contact for more than, say, 15 seconds, and that other bubble was tested positive recently, you will get a notification on your phone saying, hey, we can't tell you who because of healthcare regulations, but somebody in your office who you've been in contact with has tested positive recently. Here's how you can get tested, and just kind of guide them through the testing process. So that's kind of where I see what I would like to see in 2021, because even as you get a lot of people vaccinated, no matter where you are in the country, there's going to be at least a certain percentage of the people that are never going to get vaccinated. That's just the reality. We have, that's how it works in the States. And so people have the choice to get vaccinated. So I've been vaccinated. I advocate for people to get vaccinated, but that doesn't mean people are going to do it. And so unless you reach that herd immunity that the CDC keeps talking about, where the virus essentially goes away because everybody's been vaccinated, you're going to need some sort of mitigation process or control of the virus. And that's kind of what I think would be a first step.
All right. No, that's very interesting. And I've seen a local business. I thought it was a very good response. They're just a doggy daycare, like, so they're smaller, they've only got so many staff. They can't implement the bigger stuff like you were talking about, the bigger businesses can. And so when a couple of the girls tested positive, they closed down for a week, had everybody go get tested, and then waited. They didn't do the rapid one. What's it called? The PCR.
Yeah, yeah.
Yeah, so they did the PCR test, the longer one, got everybody tested. It was 2 weeks. And then once they could verify that, who was exposed, everybody else checked out, and they had been able to sanitize everybody, 2 weeks later they opened. So I thought that was a good response from a small business perspective. And every time I'm in there, it's limited capacity for a while. Like when the numbers, like last year, you didn't even come in. They came out to your car, got your dog for you, and they did everything over the phone. So you'd call in and handle transaction, everything that way to limit contact, which is really good because sometimes you got to take your dog somewhere.
Yeah.
So I've seen like that kind of response, and it reminds me of what you were talking about with the smaller businesses, just the taking the necessary precautions for distance and mask and things that they can do with minimal cost too.
Yeah, and actually that's a good point because that business owner, whoever they are, they I know that they're very well informed because, and this is, I mean, I think um, early on, at least 50% of our time we spent educating people on how the virus actually spreads, right? So if you tested PCR positive for the virus, right? Um, Within 14 days of that test, you are no longer considered um, infectious, which means that you will continue to test positive for sometimes weeks. And we've had people test positive for, I don't know, something. I think we had one customer that came in and he tested positive, and he came in 3 weeks later, tested positive, and then a month and a half later tested positive. And he's just like, there must be something wrong with your test. Nobody can test positive this long. And the reality is that they can. The difference is you're positive, but you're no longer infectious. So with the doggy care example, the person in charge of making that decision, they obviously knew that, hey, if somebody tested positive and everybody else got tested, right, and somebody was positive there and everybody else was negative, after 14 days, we are pretty safe to go back because even though that one person will still test positive or not, uh, they are no longer infectious. They're no longer shedding the virus. So it's good to hear that some businesses still have, or were able to actually utilize the knowledge that was out there because there's so much misinformation nowadays, obviously, and in a lot of ways that contributed to a lot of the confusion. But that's a good example of how a small business can make good use of the information that's out there and to continue to operate. Um, a lot of individuals and companies that we've tested had a lot of hesitance around like what should I do? How about the rapid test? How about the PCR test? That's just because it was just kind of an avalanche of misinformation out there all the time.
Mhm. It's very interesting to hear like why that 14 days was in place because we'd hear it a lot of times like people traveling, things like that. They'd have to like quarantine in a hotel for 14 days and then it dropped back to a week and then like 4 or 5 days. And I was like, didn't know where any of these numbers were coming from, where the 2 weeks started, and things like that. I know one thing that impressed me about like doggy daycare is they were very transparent. They kept emailing all of their customers, keeping their customers appraised of the situation, and we're just very transparent, and things like that. So that, and they even talked about like if you still need some sort of accommodation for your dog, we're able to help you in that 2 week time frame, get that sort. So it was impressive because as a business, I thought they handled it very well. And it sounds like from your side, you think so too. But knowing where that 14 days comes from, because I think that was a huge thing is people kept hearing it. And then somebody heard a week in my family and they're like living and abiding by that. But I was like, okay, where's all this information come from? What is the 14-day, what does that mean?
So
And
that recommendation comes from the CDC. Um, so you know that I guess that's I'm pretty passionate about this subject specifically because the CDC and even the international organizations around health guidelines got a lot of criticism last year for putting out guidance and then taking it back and changing their mind and yes, they did put out a lot of guidance that ended up changing after, but we have to understand that they were learning on the fly, right? There was no roadmap for this. Like nobody said, "Hey guys, 2020, there's going to be a virus coming. Just get ready. It's airborne. This is the checklist of items that you should watch out for." They were literally testing people and utilizing laboratories like us to test different things, different strains, different exposure times, just all different parameters to figure out what are the guidelines that we're going to put out. And so they didn't just wing it, right? There are a lot of smart people from all different parts of the world. and they would put out this guideline. So the 14-day guideline was put out by initially the International Health Association and eventually the CDC, which they kind of mirror the same um, guidance. And it just kind of became a standard early on. And then recently, not recently, but a few months ago, they dropped it down to about 10 days. But that's because they had enough data, right, to determine, okay, we've tested enough people, we've PCR tested enough people to determine that when somebody's been or tested positive after 10 days, they can no longer spread the virus. So those guys were under immense pressure. I can't even imagine because, you know, we have to think, obviously, within our lifetime, we haven't had anything like this. And we had Zika about 10 years ago. We had Ebola that was pretty much centered around Africa, never really jumped over to, not in the major way, to different countries as contained before. So we didn't really have any examples of how to deal with this stuff. You know, it's like if a meteor hits Earth tomorrow, we're going to have to figure it out because the last time this happened was millions of years ago. You know, it's like, no, there's no book where you go and look and search for this stuff. So these guys are put in a really tough position. And I think for the most part, they did a good job. You know, I think in a lot of ways, media was not very informative or not very clear about what was being said. You know, we unfortunately live in a world where only negative news makes the headlines, you know? And so if it wasn't, you know, somebody died or, you know, somebody made a mistake or something like that, they wouldn't report it. And so when the new guidelines are being put out and they were positive, nobody was reporting on it. So like you said, your family saw 7 days somewhere. And, you know, some people, like the importance of the information that's out there cannot be overlooked, right? I mean, being able to get information from a reliable source is just so important because, I mean, think about when there was discussion, and I know like people say Trump started it and then somebody else, whatever, but when they were talking about the hydroxychloroquine, that you could drink it and you could do, so the amount of people that kind of said, oh, I'm going to go that route. I mean, people can easily get kind of swayed in a specific direction because of the person who's delivering the message, right? And so, unfortunately, you know, there's been a lot of misinformation, and but in general, just to answer your question, I think that the CDC did a pretty decent job with the tools that they had to put out guidance for people to social distance and mask and, you know, try to avoid gatherings and things like that. And they've been updating it since. I mean, we're on the weekly call with the CDC where they update us on new guidance and things like that. So
That's a really cool, you know, keeping up to date with them like that on a weekly basis, a really cool, you know, then, you know, your information, you can ask those questions, which is nice. It's also just, I think with the news and the way it spreads and like information with social media, I think some of it, you don't even know the source. It just validates a hope that you have. So a lot of people really want this to be over. So when they hear news that it's safe to gather and things like that, then they jump on it because that's what they want it to be. So it's validating that hope that we're getting to the place we should be versus trying to step back and actually look at all of the information, trying to measure the accuracy and find a source for it and say, is this what I should be listening to or not? So
yeah, I mean, I didn't tell you this in the beginning, but my background is in software engineering. So I appreciate the power of social media and news as it operates today. And you know, the interesting thing about the times that we live in terms of social media and delivery of information is that, you know, the information that you're reading on your Google News feed or wherever you get your news, Facebook or wherever it is essentially catered to what you believe in, right? So if you believe the earth is flat and you start looking that up, inevitably you're going to be fed information that's going to validate what you believe. So that's sort of created um, information bubbles. And, we talk about like political bubbles and, things like that, but there is a bubble for everything. So if you think that not wearing a mask, for example, is the way to go, and you start sort of putting that out there, you're inevitably going to have overwhelming information that's going to validate what you think is right. And so it's very easy to get kind of lost in the whirlwind of just what I think. And I think, in a lot of ways, that's what's contributed to people just doing whatever they thought. Now, I don't think that people are just maliciously saying, I'm not going to wear a mask because I want everybody else to get the virus. And I think people truly believe that they don't think that the virus is that deadly, because how many people have you heard say, I don't know anybody who's died? I mean, they talk about 500,000 people, but I don't know a single person. How's that possible? Okay.
Yeah,
I mean, there's some
I've heard
validity
that.
to that, right? If you don't know anybody, how are you gonna? And you hear this from from news, and you think, okay, well, how much are they really reporting? Are they overblowing it because they're just trying to get negative news that makes the headlines more? So it's kind of a complicated. I mean, in a lot of ways, I think the um, this pandemic could not have come in a worse time in terms of information, because we live in a time where information is so readily available. I mean, I can go on my phone now, forget about my computer. 20 years ago, when I was like out of college, you had to have a laptop or computer's access to some sort of computer. Your phone now is 1,000 times more powerful than a computer from 20 years ago. So you can go on your phone and listen to a podcast or watch a piece of news, or go to Instagram, go to social media, and you can get news on anything that's happening anywhere in the world live. Not even like an hour later, immediately, right away, right now, I can jump on and see anything I want. So it's kind of, it comes sort of at a cost, I think, because um, essentially anyone can put out news, right? If I wanted to create a, I don't know, a news channel of some sort, and I want to put out my opinion as news, I could do that. And in a lot of ways, that's what's been going on. So I think the ability for people to get information, especially information that's catered to what they believe, has caused a lot of problems around the pandemic, and that's what's contributed to a lot of misinformation.
Yeah, and I know, yeah, I never thought of it that way either, like your bubbles of information, but it's very true because like Instagram and all these platforms are built so that once you start interacting with certain accounts and certain different things, whether that's your normal feed, the explore page, whatever, it will filter things down so that it fits that sphere of stuff that you like to interact with. It caters it towards you. And that means you're probably interacting with like-minded people or things like that, and you tend to trust their opinion. So if some kind of misinformation gets into that bubble, it gets passed around like wildfire.
Right.
And usually 10 people are sharing it once, and then that just keeps multiplying until people believe it as fact. And that
Right.
happens in like minutes.
Right. Yeah. I mean, I am old enough to remember when social media was not around. So in the 90s, if you didn't get to, have a conversation with somebody and actually debated, you couldn't spread misinformation. There was no way. Like, you could email people. Um, you could go out in the in the city and talk to a bunch of people like they do in Washington in front of the White House, and you could try to persuade people to do it, but there was no way for you to just become a relevant voice essentially overnight. And now you have a bunch of people whose credentials have not been vetted by anyone, and they can go out there and just say whatever they want, and in a lot of ways that's good, because it allows people to get, I mean, there's been so many creative people that have been able to get the word out, right? think about how many artists and people that are really creative and really good at what they do that have been able to utilize the communications channels that we have now to be able to get their information out. But with that comes, a lot of this misinformation. So it's very interesting times for sure, aside from all of the pandemic stuff.
Yeah, definitely a two-sided coin. And I mean, that influence goes far because I was talking to somebody from Hong Kong this morning, you know, you casually like just in a chat and it's like instant. And the one day I was talking to her, I was like, what time is it? It was like midnight. I was like, what are you doing up? But it was easy. It's so smooth and like it's not just spreading it around town. It's literally like it hits the world instantly. Anybody who has access to these platforms, which many, many countries do, as soon as you post it, it's live there too. There's no distance on social media. So,
Right, and in a lot of ways, you know, we live in times where people get held accountable. For example, when you look at all the shootings that are going on and the violence that's out there, it's immediately online, and people are enraged by it. So, um, you know, things that are happening abroad, all of that stuff. I mean, there's no way to get away from a camera nowadays. So, if you're out living in the world, even if you're in the wild, there's likely a camera looking at you. So, in a way that kind of keeps people honest a little bit.
mhm, hopefully. But it's very interesting because that whole thing, all of the experience with social media and the way information spreads made this a very interesting experience. And like the woman in Hong Kong, she had to come to America briefly. She's originally from like LA. So she came back to visit to get some paperwork and other stuff done, visit her cats and do things like that. And so she was talking about because that's the first time she had traveled in Hong Kong. I think it's still one of the stricter places in the world as far as regulations and things like that. Whereas in the US, we're so big and so diverse and yeah, I mean, many states are the size of small countries or large countries. Um, so, she flew into California and she was like blown away at how different things were. So she's messaging, she's online talking about her experiences there. And then people are responding to that. She's got 100 some thousand followers, right? That are seeing that and being like, well, this airline's doing this or blah, blah, blah. And so then there was information like that. People like her are talking about their experiences, information about who's testing, who's not, who's being, following through with their processes and who's not, was going around. I don't hear that as much anymore. Now, what I hear a lot of if people are traveling or things like that is, did they get vaccinated in time for the process, submitting the paperwork to show testing or vaccination, records and things like that to travel. Um, that's a lot of what I heard about recently. Not as many people are doing it, or if they are doing it, they're road tripping to mountains and hiking. So,
Yeah, I mean, I was in. I know at least. I was in Hawaii last month. Sorry, my dog is guarding me here. Um, I was in Hawaii last month, and they have one of the most, because they're an island, they benefit from the only way to get there is by flying. So
mhm,
they put on very strict guidelines. You need to get PCR tested within 72 hours.
mhm,
And until last month, even if you've been vaccinated, they didn't take that as an acceptable way of getting in. And I think it was because of the different strains of the virus, or they didn't actually, it might be because there is no standard way of showing proof of vaccination. If you've been vaccinated, it's basically a piece of paper, right? So that can be easily faked.
mhm,
Um, and so they hadn't made the change to accept it yet. I think they must have a process in place now, but until then, you had to show PCR test and you had to do the symptom check and answer a bunch of questions. Every day that I was there, I had to go in. The app would send me a reminder saying, "Hey, have you been exposed? You think that you are symptomatic? Yada yada yada." And then, so they had that in place, but oddly, the United States through the entire pandemic until recently, until January, almost 10 months after this beginning of the lockdown, we had no requirement for people to get tested to fly back into the States. So I could have flown back home to Brazil and then flown back to the States. I was required to get tested to get in Brazil, but not to fly back into the States. It's very strange
Mhm.
because no matter how you slice it, you can't argue that people from different countries flew in positive and helped spread the virus in the States. So, um, another one of those interesting things about the pandemic.
It is very interesting to hear that too, because I know last year people were saying, "Oh, there's a lot of restrictions coming into the country. Our country, like for some reason, a lot of people were telling me, "Oh, like you can't just come into the country and not get tested. Like they know for sure if they have the virus or not." And then she came in from Hong Kong, I want to say like November, September, November, somewhere in the fall, and she had to get tested like Hong Kong, she was flying one of their airlines. She had to get tested to get on the plane and had to do they had her do all the paperwork. And she had like the form, like her health declaration form. And when she got off, nobody would take it. Like she tried to find somebody to take it and like nobody would take it. She got all the way back to Hong Kong with the same form after her trip. Um, and nobody took the form the entire time. And she was there for 2 weeks and she quarantined the entire time. So she was in the US, but everything was like sent to her and things like that. She didn't have any interaction. And she did like all of the regulation they had in Hong Kong. And there was nothing to indicate to anybody that she would have been staying around, that she had just flown in from a foreign country, that, she'd not been tested or anything. And so that was interesting because when I mentioned that to other people, they said, "Oh no, everything's regulated. The airlines are very strict." Um,
Yeah, that's definitely not been the case in the States. And there you have an example of one person who took it upon herself to self quarantine and make sure that she was following the guidelines that she knew worked, because Hong Kong was one of the first countries to
mhm.
to sort of get things under control. Um, but had I, for example, flown from Brazil, which is a country that's been um, highly regarded as one of the worst places to go with COVID-19, I think only second to the States in terms of number of infections. Um, the people that are coming into the States from Brazil don't have the same kind of mindset in terms of quarantine, make sure you don't
Mhm.
expose people. They would just come in and gone to Disney or gone to wherever they wanted to go because, I don't know, the country's not requiring anything. I'm just going to do whatever I want. Um, so yeah, it's interesting how each country and depends on where you come from, um, the sort of these protocols work out. So just before we started the interview, I was reading about um, a couple that was vacationing Bali uh, last week, and I think they were YouTubers or Instagrammers, I don't know, some sort of influencer,
Yeah.
and they wanted to make fun. They wanted to not make fun, but they wanted to, I don't know, create a post to share on their social media. So instead of walking into the grocery store with a mask, they painted a mask on their face, almost like those body paints, just to be funny and film. And they were arrested, and they're now facing deportation because they were not following the guidelines, and the government is not taking it lightly. So, there you have it, a complete opposite end of the spectrum where, you got a country that's got a lot of tourism, especially from the States. And I think she's actually from Hong Kong, but she's lives in California, and her partner is Russian. And they're following it, and they're not messing around. They're serious about it, and they're not going to put up with it. There was one couple months ago before I went. I was looking up the regulation and what the requirements were, and a couple was arrested in Hawaii for having forged a PCR test result. So they took a page from like an old test or something. They changed the dates or something and presented it, and then they were arrested on the spot. And I think they had their son with them, so it was a whole thing. I don't know what ended up happening, but you know, even at the
Mhm.
state level in the U.S., because states get to make their own regulation, it varies a lot.
It does. Yeah. And I know I have friends in some of the more southern states that are relaxing like mask mandates and some of the other things, whereas like up here, it's still mandated everywhere. And so it'll be weird to look at their photos and like nobody's wearing masks. Whereas like, if you take off your mask just for a photo here, people give you dirty looks if you're around them. Um,
Yeah.
so it's just very interesting to see it. As far as like the business perspective, if you have an employee that is traveling for whatever reason, whether it's like a trade show or work related event or a vacation, what do you recommend the business do as far as um, when they come back to take precautions to make sure that they don't bring anything back with them?
Yeah. So what we do, and we actually we are owned by a group that owns other entities in the behavioral health space and technology and other companies. It's pretty large conglomerate. And when they travel, they obviously refer to us for guidance on, what do we do? So the way we've handled that with them and other employers that work with us is um, when they return, they would quarantine for at least 3 days, and that's because we want that that incubation process to take place. And the reason we do 3 days is because if they could have been infected all the way up until they got in the Uber from the airport to their house, right? Who knows? So 3 days allows sort of the incubation process, and then we would PCR test them on day 3 or day 4. And if they're negative, then they're likely, you know, uh, they didn't get infected during the trip. They're good to go. That's kind of how we've been handling that. Some companies, what they're doing is the companies that actually understand how it works. Um, they have their employees rapid tested when they land, or a few hours after. And that's because, again, the rapid test is kind of picking up that replication process. And so you're able to identify it there and get PCR tested again on day 3 and 4.
Okay. It was just interesting. I know we're actually a software development company, kind of going back to your background. And we're in the trade show space and things like that right now. And one of our industries that we work closely with is the janitorial. So we do see more trade shows popping up. And with that particular industry, they love the face-to-face interaction. Like they have been a very in-person type industry for a long time. So we like to go where our customers are and meet them at their level. And that is the thing now we're seeing is we've had people travel for the first time in a while. And to places like, Florida and some of the warmer states where it's warmer, you're going to want to be out more without mask outside and doing stuff like that and enjoying yourself and just, taking a mini vacation while you're down there. So I was really curious from that because that's something many businesses, as we come back in person, are going to see more and more of with summer coming too. So,
Yeah, so one of the initiatives that we took about 6 months ago was I spoke about that in the beginning of the interview, is to provide testing solutions um, for events. So we've done a couple of different ones. We've done a couple of weddings. We've done a couple of small trade shows, primarily here in South Florida. We did a corporate get together in Salt Lake City 2 weeks ago. We did another event in Seattle, another one in New York. Um, so what we are seeing is that yes, people want to get back to face as much as possible within reason. Zoom is great because perhaps if Zoom wasn't around, we wouldn't be able to do this interview. Like, who knows
mhm,
if I could have flown in, you could have flown to Miami, who knows? Like, so in a lot of ways, I think it opened up for a lot of opportunity to communicate
mhm.
worldwide. Um, but yeah, the face to face, there's really no replacement for face to face. People like to meet in person, and there's definitely value in that. Um, So what we have been working on or working toward is to offer, again, sort of a comprehensive approach to um, testing if people want to be in a space together. So what we've been working on is to offer that comprehensive solution where people can kind of be in the same space as safely as possible. So that does not mean you're going to remove your mask, you're going to shake hands, you're going to hug, and you're going to, no. Those guidelines remain in place. So what we do is, well, kind of, a couple of different options. So we work with the event hosts to PCR test everyone who's going to attend the event um, within 3 days of actually showing up to the event. So an example with that would be, let's say you, AA Solutions, is holding an event in Toledo, Ohio. You're going to have 100 people there, and they're coming from all over the country, perhaps even outside of the country. So you reach out to us. We work with you or the event host. Say you outsource it to a company to put it together, and we get a list of all the guests. We work with you to put together a registration system where all of the guests can register for PCR test. We mail the kit to their house for a self swab. They send the kit back to the lab, directly to the lab, and we report the results directly to the guest and to the hosts. So the guests get to get tested before they even leave the house, because they could be positive, and you don't want them to get on the plane if they're positive. Obviously, you don't want them to go to the event. So we report the results to them, and we report to the host, so that the host has sort of can keep track of everyone that's coming in, and they've been sort of check mark that they're negative up to that point. Once on the day of the event, and if it's a multi-day event, we do it on every day of the event. We rapid test everybody at the event. So then we have staff that physically goes to the event location, and we set up essentially like a test site where everyone checking in has to have their temperature checked and has to have a rapid test. And the reason we do a rapid test is, again, because of the replication process, and because the rapid tests are really good at catching the spread early on, and to cover those last 72 to 96 hours from when they tested positive or negative PCR at home to the time they actually showed up to the venue. So if they've been infected from the PCR test, on the flight, wherever, we would pick it up at the entrance of the event. And then we also offer random testing throughout the event. So again, if it's a week-long event, for example, and somebody becomes symptomatic or doesn't feel well, or there are indications that they might be positive, we can test them on site as well. And if they do come up positive, we have the ability to do what's called a reflex test, which is a PCR test on top of the rapid test that gets sent out to the lab. So we've seen a lot of different approaches to testing for events, and we think that that's the most comprehensive one right now. I'm sure as technology evolves throughout the year, things are going to change. I mentioned earlier about sort of the instrumented rapid tests that are becoming more and more efficient and accurate. So I think a lot of the testing is going to migrate over to that side. When you start talking about large events like a concert, for example, then it gets really complicated, because if you're doing a trade show, then you can enforce some sort of social distancing. Last year, for example, I went to Disney in July, in the middle of the pandemic. My nephew flew in. They live in Portugal. My nephew flew in to visit me. He really wanted to go, and I heard that Disney had really strict protocols in place, and they did. I mean, you couldn't even walk around without a mask at all. They would catch you within a second. And some people, if you've flown during the pandemic, people tend to like hold a drink or something they're eating to kind of make it look like they're actively eating or drinking, so they don't have to wear a mask. Disney did not put up with that at all. if you wanted to eat or drink, you had to be in the corner, not walking. And so, you felt pretty safe. But when you're talking about a concert, it becomes really hard to enforce social distancing because you're literally shoulder to shoulder with people, right? There have been concerts, I think the Oscars, I didn't watch it, but somebody told me that they were out at a train station for the Oscars 2 weekends ago, and people were like 10 feet apart. And it's not the same thing. I don't think you're going to have like a large concert with a third of the guests showing up, right? I don't know how they're going to do that. I think,
I've
yeah.
Yeah, I've seen where they'll have like sections so that groups come together, they get their own section. I've seen this for outdoor movie theaters too, like in Hong Kong and things like that. So I've seen that, like especially last summer when people were like desperately in need of doing something, or having like a drive up concert. So people were in their cars. But we have Toledo in particular, we have the Solheim Cup coming up shortly. And I know it'll be kind of interesting because there's events coming and it's going to be down by our river in a park that we have. And so there's going to be events and then there's going to be a smaller concert area with limited capacity. But there is concert with two bigger guests. I think like Gwen Stefani and somebody else are coming, like some big guests. Um, so it's kind of looking like it's shaping up. Like I think the concert itself tickets are already sold out, and that's in like July or August. So I'm interested to see how they move forward with that kind of stuff too.
Yeah, I think the reason that they're going in that direction, I just actually was looking at tickets to go to a concert in July. So June, July, August, I think things are going to look a lot different. I
Hmm.
know it seems like right around the corner, but in terms of what's going on, it's like a lifetime. Um, and I think that the reason they're able to do that is because they're going to require that you can show that you've been vaccinated, right? At which point, even if somebody coughs in your face, you would likely be okay because you've been vaccinated. Um, well, sort of, because there are different strains of the virus and it gets a little complicated, but generally speaking, you would be less likely to be infected and have some sort of health issue. Or you're going to be required to get PCR tested. Now, does that completely remove all of the possibilities of being infected? No. Even somebody who's been vaccinated can get COVID-19. You're seeing that with the different strains now, the Brazil strain, the South Africa strains, and things like that. But it dramatically decreases the possibility. And so I don't think you're going to have a situation where it's 100% safe. But for 99% of the people that are generally healthy, have been vaccinated, or have gotten the PCR test, you're going to be able to get around and do stuff in the summer, I think. Um, and then for the people that are not getting vaccinated, I think personally, I think is going to become harder and harder to do things, only because I see, and this is totally a personal opinion, I don't know, this is how it's going to go, but I think that especially as we get into the 60, 65, 70% vaccination rate in the country, I think the federal government is going to really push for everyone to get vaccinated. And it's going to somehow incentivize people to get vaccinated. And you're already seeing that with the recent bill they pushed, like, I think they call it money in pockets, vaccine in arms or something. I don't know what it is, but they're physically paying somebody to get vaccinated. And that's because, somebody's doing the math and saying it's going to cost a lot more for us to keep testing people than you would if we just got to a certain threshold where essentially if you vaccinate, I think they talk about somewhere around 80%, 85%, then you essentially don't need masks or testing because the virus will go away on its own because you can't jump from person to person, right? That's what they refer
Hmm.
to as herd immunity. So, but back to what you're saying before, I think what these large event venues are going to be doing more and more is vaccination or PCR test to enter. And I know that because there is an event happening May 20th here, the South Beach Wine and Food Festival. And we're going to be testing a lot of people for that event. Um, and that's exactly what they're requiring. You do a questionnaire on the app, you get PCR tests or you show that you've been vaccinated, and then you can attend. And that's an outdoor event, right? It's not even indoor. So I think that's kind of where that's going to go. But I do think that over time, perhaps end of the year, when it starts to get cold, I think we're going to see the states and federal government kind of ratcheting down on, you know, getting more and more people vaccinated. And we're seeing a lot of that, even in Florida, for example. Like this week, we are going to start mobilizing to provide mobile vaccines. So we're going to retrofit a bus or a van with a bunch of medical staff to go to specific pockets of the state where people just have either refused to get vaccinated or have, decided that they're going to wait to see kind of how things go. And so they're going to deploy these mobile units to different parts of the state, parts of the state that are underserved. Perhaps people can't don't have a car to drive to a vaccination center, or can't take the day off. So we're going to hold these events on a Saturday, a Sunday, or whatever, to be able to get to those people, because you have a slice of the population that just doesn't want to get vaccinated. And then you have the other slice that just can't because, again, it goes back to kind of the nature of the business, right? If you work in an office, like for me to be able to take a day off, yeah, I can because I run a company, so I don't have to respond to anybody. But for somebody working at a grocery store, that might be difficult. Like if their employer is not allowing them to take the day off to go get vaccinated, it's almost like voting, right? You're likely not going to do it. And if you don't have access to a place right around the corner, you're probably going to wait until you can. And until you can, maybe too late.
Yeah. No, it'll be interesting to see how we go, but from what I've seen, I would agree with you. I could see us moving more in that direction too. Especially with, I mean, for a while people said, oh, it's going to be a political thing to get vaccinated, but it really hasn't been. I've known people with all kinds of different perspectives decide to start getting vaccinated, and more people who said, I don't know if I'm going to do it. They were either on the fence or said they wouldn't. I've seen them get vaccinated. Um, like half my house is vaccinated. I've got one more shot to go. So it is very interesting to see. It'll be interesting to see, you know, businesses going forward as far as requiring for in person if they require to be vaccinated or things like that. So I'll be interested. All right. Do you have any other remarks or any other points that you would like to touch on before we wrap up?
No, I think we covered a lot.
I think we did too. I think it was very good, though. It's super informative, and somebody listening in, I think they're going to be able to follow along with this conversation, and they'll be able to ask you questions. So we'll set up a place that they can submit questions that they have or things like that, and that we can share them with you, and we can keep this conversation going after the episode is live. So
That'd be awesome.
all right. So as you heard, everyone, if you have questions regarding any of the topics that we talked about or anything that LabDX might be able to help with, you can just send them right over to us through our email, or you can go over to our landing page and we'll have a place for you to submit them there. So thank you for tuning in, and keep watch as we continue to provide more resources and material. Thank you.